If we wanted to give an example of how psychoanalysis works, who would we choose as our subject? Who is the one person in the history of psychology whose life is the most well documented, whose personality is the most scrutinized, and whose work is the most debated? This is an origin story. It's a story about the origins of psychoanalysis and of its creator, Sigmund Freud. It's the story of Freud on the unconscious, Freud on dreams, and Freud on coke. We will begin with the psychoanalysis of a dream, and then broaden to the psychoanalysis of its dreamer. Taking Freud as our example, we will read the dream as a microcosm of the unconscious, and present the unconscious as a text, the unconscious as a chain of signifiers, the unconscious structured like a language. We will show how psychoanalysis works by connecting the dream far beyond the day's dramas, far beyond the waking associations and latent thoughts, to the dreamer's wider biography. We will look at Freud's early childhood, his later life, his career, his passions, and his creation, a creation which, perhaps more than any other, is most personally associated with the psychology of its creator. But this is not just about Freud. We will look beyond Freud's life to his prehistory, his family history, and what is true for all of us about where we have come from and of what our psychology is the product. Because many of the most important things in our life happen to us, not because of us. Accidents of fate, chance encounters, things we are told or see, the circumstances surrounding our birth. We remember some things rather than others. Certain things are important to us rather than others, and we can't say why. The deepest mysteries of our lives are the result of things that are incidental, circumstantial, contingent. Who we love, why we love them, what we choose to do or make or be. But they are not arbitrary. There must be a reason why they matter, even if they matter only to us. There must be an answer to the question, why this rather than that? One night, in early March 1898, Sigmund Freud had a dream. I had written a monograph on a certain plant. The book lay before me, and I was at the moment turning over a folded coloured plate. Bound up in each copy there was a dried specimen of the plant, as though it had been taken from a herbarium. Earlier that day, Freud had received a letter from a friend in Berlin. I am very much occupied with your dream book. I see it lying finished before me, and I see myself turning over its pages. That book was what would become the interpretation of dreams. But Freud hadn't written it yet. And it's not a book on dreams he sees in the dream. It's one on plants. These days, there is only one plant that Freud is remembered for, and not for the reasons he had hoped at the time. Years earlier, in the summer of 1884, Freud had written a promising monograph on the anesthetic properties of the coca plant, from which we get cocaine. And of course, he had tried some himself and loved it. His 1885 Uber Coca is his love letter to the drug. But high and possibly horny, he longed to visit his fiancée Martha in Hamburg. And so later that summer, he put his research on hold and told his friend, Dr. Konigstein, to work on it while he was gone. When he returned to Vienna in the autumn, he was horrified to find that a certain Dr. Koller had read Freud's monograph and expanded on it himself, beating both Freud and Konigstein to publication, announcing the discovery of cocaine as a local anaesthetic for eye surgery. If only I had been more dedicated to my research, Freud thinks. Instead of chasing a woman, I could have claimed credit for the discovery myself. This thought is reawakened in Freud by a chance remark from the same Dr. Konigstein on the day of the dream, that Freud was spending too much time and money on his hobbies. Then other thoughts from the day of the dream start coming back to Freud. He had seen through a bookseller's window a new work titled The Genus Cyclamen. This is it, in fact. Cyclamens, thinks Freud, that's my wife's favourite flower. Later that same evening, he walked home with Dr. Konigstein. Since the missed opportunity with cocaine years earlier, Konigstein had used cocaine as an anaesthetic while operating on Freud's father. And, in fact, their old rival, Dr. Koller, had administered the anaesthetic. When they arrive, they see a Professor Gartner and his wife in the entrance. Gartner is German for gardener. Freud remarks on their blooming looks. So let's go step by step in how we would analyse this dream. We can begin at the centre, with what we call the formation of the unconscious. That is, something that tells us that the unconscious exists, that there is something else at work. Something else is being said, as if on a different stage or in a different scene. Dreams, symptoms, slips are all formations of the unconscious. The very first thing we have in a dream is the manifest material, that is, what Freud remembers when he wakes up. And already we have a series of associative connections that Freud makes to this manifest material which tell us that the dream is not totally random. Freud can see it relates to certain elements of the day before or even earlier in his life. And these trigger certain impressions in him, certain latent thoughts which seem to suggest something, which seem to point to a possible meaning of the dream. Now, these thoughts concern competition between colleagues, ambition to make a great discovery, and the wish that, if only he had followed his head rather than his heart, his would have been the name attached to this great discovery about cocaine. The way Freud writes this makes it sound pretty cut and dry. What it meant was, after all, I am the man who wrote the valuable and memorable paper on cocaine. And we could probably leave it at that, were he not to ever so slightly change his story when he's relating the dream later on. The dream thoughts were concerned with the complications and conflicts arising between colleagues from their professional obligations, and further with the charge that I was in the habit of sacrificing too much for the sake of my hobbies. And a bit further, another variant. The thoughts corresponding to it consisted of a passionately agitated plea on behalf of my liberty to act as I chose, to act and to govern my life as seemed right to me and me alone. These are different things. This last explanation is a bit more cryptic and a bit looser in meaning than the first. Rather than seeing this as simply a difference in phraseology, it suggests to Freud himself that the way the dream is constructed represents an amalgamation of contrary elements, and that this accounts for the strangeness of how they're presented in the images which make up the dream. Now, Freud is a good detective, and he knows that something doesn't add up. After all, there's nothing particularly revealing in his acknowledgement that he harboured feelings of rivalry towards his colleagues, or the self-accusation that he might be guilty of spending too much time and money on his hobbies instead of working on making great scientific discoveries. There's no big deal here. There's no dark secret. There's nothing really unconscious about it. But then, why doesn't the dream just present it as it is? Why this ciphering that seems to be at work? Looking again at the dream, Freud notices something else. If we take the manifest content and compare it to the latent thoughts that his associations lead to, we find that they have different focal points. The central point of this dream, the part that makes the greatest impression on Freud, is the botanical monograph. But the central point of his latent thoughts are the associations to the discovery of cocaine as an anaesthetic. The more intense the image in the dream, the more intense the thoughts linked to it. In short, the image is a substitute for the thought. But then, why is a substitute needed in the first place? More evidence that something strange is going on. And so, Freud starts listing out all of the associative connections to the two standout elements in the dream, botanical, monograph, that come to his mind. We won't go through them all, but here they are. And if you're looking closely, you'll see a pattern emerge from these associations. One of these, in particular, we'll come back to later. A dream, Freud says, is a factory of thoughts. It compounds the material that goes into it, like in the mechanical sense of compressing it, but also in the chemical sense. It is a compound. It conjoins different associative threads. Not only the compound idea botanical monograph, however, but each of its components, botanical and monograph separately, led by numerous connecting paths deeper and deeper into the tangle of dream thoughts. The compound element here is botanical. It is a crossroad or nodal point where different latent thoughts meet. In other words, the connections between Freud's different associations appear to converge on the intermediate common entity of botanical. This is an example of what Freud calls condensation, one of the main mechanisms of the dream work. Like the element monograph, it then links to other thoughts and associations which are not necessarily connected between themselves, but just via this special load-bearing junction term, botanical. Thus, botanical was a regular nodal point in the dream, Freud says. Numerous trains of thought converged upon it. He calls it overdetermined, and as we expand outwards from this central manifest element, botanical or monograph, we find a huge profusion of associations. But the most important thing to understand is that they are not connected to each other, but to the central element. As we expand out, we get associations that seem to lead further and further away from the manifest content of the dream. But this doesn't matter. What matters is their common point of convergence. Now we're starting to move from the dream to the dreamer, zooming out from the dense mass of the dream's content to the associations Freud makes to them and the latent thoughts they lead to. All the while, we are following the dreamer's associations. We're not cherry-picking certain elements that would suit a particular interpretation because we're not trying to make an interpretation. Neither are we imposing latent thoughts on the dreamer or trying to order them in a certain way that would give us the meaning of the dream. We're sticking to the material as presented in the dream and the associations by the dreamer, following them to Freud's own latent thoughts. This is a really important point. When we try to psychoanalyze a dream, the temptation is to start grouping together latent thoughts by themes and thinking that we can thereby figure out what the dream means by reading off these underlying themes: professional ambition, competition between colleagues, and the feeling of having missed out on a great discovery. But at no point can we say what the dream means. All we have in the manifest dream is a text. And a text doesn't mean anything in and of itself. It doesn't want to say something that we can interpret. Now, Freud himself, the conquistador that he imagines himself to be, starts to do this. And it might seem obvious to us that the dream is about rivalry, ambition, and Freud's longing to make a name for himself in his field. And all of these things may be true of Freud. But that's not the secret of the dream. And Freud knew it. Which is why, as we will see, he went further. In doing so, Freud was giving us a really valuable lesson in the difference between good and bad psychoanalysis. Taking the dreamer's associations to latent thoughts and grouping them together into themes may seem to give us something we can make sense of, but in doing so we lose touch with the dreamer's own material, their own associations, what they think is important. And worse, we can end up closing down those associations so the analysis can go no further. For instance, what's to stop us assuming that the associations to cocaine and overwork mean that the dream is about addiction? Or that the references to families of plants, the compositile that includes artichokes and the genus cyclamen, mean that the dream is about family? The problem is that this is like painting the target around the arrow after it's been fired, or like artificially grouping together a random cluster of objects on a table and then finding a way to connect them to one another, in which case anything could be connected to anything else. That is not psychoanalysis. That is a free-for-all. We cannot separate the dream from the dreamer. Psychoanalysis and interpretation in particular, simply means making connections between different elements and tracing those back bit by bit. It's the job of the analyst and the dreamer to make these connections. The job of the analyst is to deconnect, not to connect. Rather than offering a meaning, the psychoanalyst's job is to simply point to the relationship between elements that have not previously been connected. If we follow what Freud is doing here, botanical or monograph in the dream are not important in and of themselves, but only insofar as they are the nodal points in the manifest dream, the intermediate links where different latent thoughts converge. The dream appears jumbled and senseless only if we try to interpret it directly. If we break it apart, see each element as crossroads or junctions to ideas that occur in different contexts, we see what Freud discovered: that the dream is condensed, overdetermined. Dreams are not totally random or arbitrary. There is something like a logic governing their construction. Freud's achievement was to discover this logic, these mechanisms or processes of the dream work, not to figure out the meaning of dreams. Dream analysis means figuring out how the dream is built, because if we can see it's built in a certain way, a way that is complex, condensed, and compounded, then we know we can't simply draw a straight line from one thing to another. Now we can take the next step beyond the first three layers of our graphs and towards the biographical. We get here thanks to a tantalizingly cryptic remark that Freud makes when he abruptly stops his analysis of the dream. Moreover, he says, I can assure my readers that the ultimate meaning of the dream, which I have not disclosed, is intimately related to the subject of the childhood scene. Whoa. All of a sudden, we have left the realm of memories from the day before, Freud's current struggles to write the dream book and his preoccupations with his professional standing. Now we're following a deeper current that relates to his childhood, and thereby his wider biography. The childhood scene in question was among the factory of associations we saw earlier to the dream. A seemingly innocent memory of tearing his father's book apart is now, according to Freud himself, the key to the dream's secret. But why is this so important? And why won't Freud tell us? Let's take a closer look at this memory as he relates it in the flow of his associations. There followed, I could not quite make out how, a recollection from very early youth. It had once amused my father to hand over a book with coloured plates, an account of a journey through Persia, for me and my eldest sister to destroy. Not easy to justify from the educational point of view. I had been 5 years old at the time, and my sister not yet 3, and the picture of the two of us blissfully pulling the book to pieces, leaf by leaf, like an artichoke, I found myself saying, was almost the only plastic memory that I retained from that period of my life. Freud grants this memory such an important place in making him who he was to become that we have to treat it as a key biographical detail. It seems so small, it seems not to matter, but it matters to him. Then, when I became a student, I had developed a passion for collecting and owning books, which was analogous to my liking for learning out of monographs, a favourite hobby. I had become a bookworm. I had always, from the time I first began to think about myself, referred this passion of mine back to the childhood memory I have mentioned. But then he adds, or rather, I had recognised that the childhood scene was a screen memory from my later bibliophile propensities. A screen memory can take one of two forms. Either an earlier memory is used as a screen for a later event, or more usually a later memory is used as a screen for an earlier event. Either way, why is it remembered in the first place? If it's a screen memory, what does it screen that's so important? If it's a real memory, why is it given such importance? Freud then points us to a footnote which simply says, "See my paper on screen memories." And what do we find when we look at that paper, written around the same time as Freud had had the dream? We find a second screen memory, chronologically the earlier of the two. The memory goes like this. I see a rectangular, rather steeply sloping piece of meadowland, green and thickly grown. In the green there are a great number of yellow flowers, evidently common dandelions. At the top end of the meadow there is a cottage, and in front of the cottage 2 women are standing chatting busily, a peasant woman with a handkerchief on her head and a children's nurse. 3 children are playing in the grass. One of them is myself, between the age of 2 or 3, and the others are my boy cousin, who is a year older than me, and his sister, who is almost exactly the same age as I am. We are picking the yellow flowers, and each of us is holding a bunch of flowers we have already picked. The little girl has the best bunch, and as though by mutual agreement, we, the 2 boys, fall on her and snatch away her flowers. She runs up the meadow in tears, and as a consolation the peasant woman gives her a big piece of black bread. Hardly have we seen this than we throw the flowers away, hurry to the cottage, and ask to be given some bread too. We are, in fact, given some. The peasant woman cuts the loaf with a long knife. In the memory, the bread tastes quite delicious, and at that point, the scene breaks off. A seemingly totally innocent and totally nondescript memory. So why is it there? Let's read it not in isolation, but alongside the other screen memory, in which Freud is tearing apart, page by page, the book on the journeys in Persia that his father had given him and his sister when he was 5. Both involve the subject, Freud alongside a girl, the verb, the act of snatching, tearing or pulling apart, and the object, each with botanical variants, the leaves of the book, like the leaves of the artichoke or the petals of the flower in the screen memory. Now this is where things really get interesting. And to delve even deeper, we're going to look at an analysis of the dream by one of Lacan's students, but a great psychoanalyst in his own right, Serge Leclerc. It's taken from his paper Unconscious Desire, with Freud reading Freud. This paper is not often talked about, but it's amazing, and part of the reason I'm making this video is because I want people to go read that paper. So here we go. This memory of flowers snatched or ripped away probably marks one of the ultimate endpoints of Freud's analysis. It seems that we can identify there at least 2 of the 3 crossroads that are, as we have been told, the points where unconscious desire burgeons above the surface. Thus, it seems to us that through these 2 screen memories, we must consider as major terms of the Freudian unconscious the words Reisen, Entreisen. The key to the dream is not a hidden meaning, but a signifier. An elementary signifier, which links the botanical monograph dream, its latent thoughts, the screen memories of tearing apart the book and the snatching away of the flowers, and the terms of Freud's biography. And, as Leclerc shows, the elementary signifier that links them all is Eisen. We can isolate the reappearance of this same signifying element across material from the dream, Freud's associations to it, the latent thoughts, and the 2 childhood memories. This is what Lacan means when he says that the unconscious is structured like a language, that the unconscious operates as a chain of signifiers. In the signifier Eisen, Leclerc claims to find one of the elementary terms of Freud's unconscious, the key not just to this dream, but the link from the dream via memories and associations to Freud's wider biography, his life. What Leclerc is highlighting is the repetition of a signifier. It's not a word, it's a fragment of a word, unhinged from any particular meaning, referent or signification, but which thereby seems to operate autonomously in that it appears repeatedly across different contexts, different moments, and different events in Freud's life. If this all sounds a bit far-fetched, let's retrace our path to see where Leclerc gets this from. The train of thoughts that converge on the signifier Eisen are firstly condensed into the element botanical that we see in Freud's dream. So we have a link between what Freud sees in the dream, his associations to its latent thoughts, and his memories which link to his wider biography. We know we haven't cherry-picked this element botanical because we start, as always, with what the dreamer says stands out to him most in the dream. In our analysis of the dream, what we are not doing is then taking all the associations and the latent thoughts they lead to and grouping them into themes and then assuming that those themes read together are the meaning of the dream. This is the mistake that lots of people make when they attempt a psychoanalysis, whether of a dream or of a person. The meaning of the dream is not ambition, competition, and professional recognition. The secret of the dream is, in fact, that there is no meaning of the dream. The dream doesn't want to say anything, communicate anything, tell us anything. It is simply a vehicle for the transmission of a signifier, Eisen in Freud's case, which repeats in and of itself, irrespective of the meanings that are drawn to it throughout Freud's life. This is true more generally. There's no such thing as an unconscious meaning. Unconscious material does not have any kind of communicative finality. Instead, it simply repeats and insists as a kind of enigmatic, absurd cipher, which is only expressed in a combinatorial, contradictory way that just involves a bringing into relation of different elements via an intermediate common entity, as Freud calls it. What Leclerc demonstrates here, following his teacher Lacan, is that these entities are signifiers, the elementary particles of a person's unconscious. Yet we are tempted to look for a meaning nonetheless. We push to meaning because we want to believe a dream has a meaning, that we can read it, that we can interpret it. We know it's not totally random, and we can see it's built a certain way through condensations and displacements like Freud has shown. The dream does not have a meaning. It is the production of a meaning. Fundamentally, Freud tells us, a dream is a way of thinking. What Freud shows us in the interpretation of dreams is that this thinking works in a very different way, which is why the product of that thinking, whether dreams, symptoms, or slips, appears so strange to us. But wait a minute. What about Freud's fundamental idea in the interpretation of dreams, that dreams represent wish fulfillment? This is where things get even more interesting. Notice that Leclerc refers to the fulfillment of the desire rather than the wish. What's the difference, and what grounds are there for making this distinction? If we look for the meaning of the dream in the themes of its latent thoughts, it would be easy to assume that this can be expressed as a first-person wish. I want to be a great man. I want to make great scientific discoveries and win the admiration of my peers. But this is wrong, and Freud says so. The elements in the neighbourhood of the wish fulfillment often have nothing to do with its meaning, but turn out to be derivatives of distressing thoughts that run contrary to the wish. Instead, Freud thinks that the wish is spread out, diffused, across the elements in the neighbourhood around it. This explains why we don't see a wish represented simply in the first person, articulated like, I wish that. Instead, what we get is a condensation, a compression or compounding into botanical as the nodal point, the crossroads where many associations of ideas meet up. Bringing together such diffuse associations as book, woman, leaves, flower, picking flowers, eating bread, at the site where they converge. What we see here, in combination with the other element, monograph, that stands out in the dream, is a series that connects with the two screen memories. Reisen, to travel, to make voyages of discovery, like those depicted in the book on voyages in Persia that Freud's father gives his son and daughter to tear apart. Heißen, to put a name to one's own discovery, like that of the discoveries on cocaine. Reißen, to pick, pluck a flower, or to rip, tear, deflower the pages of the book. And beißen, to bite into, like the bread in the screen memory. This is why the signifier Eisen is so interesting, and for Leclerc, the key to the formula for unconscious desire in the dream, and across Freud's life. So, if the dream doesn't mean anything, and we can't locate an unconscious wish within it, how do we know when we've psychoanalyzed a dream? Let's delve deeper still into Freud's early life. He remembers a nightmare from the age of 6 or 7. It was a very vivid one, and in it I saw my beloved mother, with a peculiarly peaceful, sleeping expression on her features, being carried into the room by 2 or 3 people with birds' beaks, and laid upon the bed. I awoke in tears and screaming, and interrupted my parents' sleep. Now, if a dream represents a wish fulfillment, a nightmare shows us that it's never a simple wish. Where does this nightmare come from? Freud recognises the people with birds' beaks in the dream from illustrations in a book that was present in the Freud family household when he was young. But not just any book. A copy of the Philipson Bible that would later be gifted to Freud by his father on the occasion of Freud's 35th birthday. Inside, Jakob Freud had written the following portentous inscription. My dear son, it was in the 7th year of your age that the Spirit of God began to move you to learning. I would say the Spirit of God speaketh to you. Read in my book. There will be open to thee sources of knowledge and of the intellect. Notice how we have the same motif, that of a gift of a book by the father to the son, repeated in 2 memories Freud associates to the dream. Just as the book on adventures in Persia is given to the young Freud and his sister to tear apart, so the father gives his son the gift of the Philipson Bible for his 35th birthday. Freud's associations connect. The figures with birds' beaks in the nightmare to the illustrations in the same Philipson Bible which was present in the Freud household during his childhood. The gods with falcons' heads from an ancient Egyptian funerary relief. The same expression he saw on the face of his dying father as was present on the face of his mother in the dream. A childhood acquaintance named Philip, who had used a vulgar term meaning bird as slang for fucking. And lastly, an early childhood memory of seeing his mother's naked body during a train journey from Leipzig to Vienna. Freud will go on to develop a lifelong fear of missing trains. So the associations connect to latent thoughts on the themes of sex and death. But as we've seen, we can't stop there. Leclerc sees the nightmare as a structural variant where these images denote only the insistent repetition of an enigma rather than the satisfaction of a wish. In the place of meaning, we have a figuration of that enigma. It's a formula, cipher, or letter that aims more at insisting, at repeating itself enigmatically than at saturating, gratifying, or suturing itself in some fashion. What he is doing here is to rephrase desire, not in the optive first-person form, like I wish that, but as an expression or formula. And the formula, he suggests, in Freud's case, can be phrased as follows. To reveal a secret. This formula speaks as much to Freud's wider biography as it does to the individual dream. In replacing wish with desire, Leclerc is on the one hand acknowledging the indirectness of the wish expressed in a nightmare, and on the other, delinking the wish from its object. If the wish has no object, if it's not a wish for something, then it cannot be expressed with the first-person pronoun. Instead of an articulated wish, the construction of a formula helps us think about what in Lacanian terms would be called Freud's fundamental fantasy. It's not simply an incestuous desire, nor a love of books. No, thinks Leclerc, the love of books is animated by a deeper desire, because he will not be content to be a bibliophile, collector and erudite reader of books. Freud will write a book, and he will write it on precisely the fact of desire. This is how he fulfills his childhood desire, which may be expressed as tearing away the secret from, in this case, dreams. So Leclerc has traced a path from the botanical theme common to both childhood memories, in which are combined two currents which resolve into a single element, botanical, in the dream. This leads us to the discovery of the same signifier, eisen and treißen, to tear from, rip from, snatch from, or pull at, pointing to the tearing, ripping, snatching, or pulling at the leaves of the book, like the leaves of the artichoke in one memory, and to the tearing, ripping, snatching, or pulling at the girl's flowers in the other. It is through the repetition of this signifier that the associative chain which runs book, leaf, plant, woman is established. Freuds Life follows the passage and repetition of this signifier as he goes on to write a dream book that satisfies both passions at the same time. In both senses in which it's presented in the dream of the botanical monograph, Freud will unveil, reveal, and tear apart. Thinking about unconscious desire as a formula is more than just a way to approach dream analysis. What we look for in a psychoanalysis is a much more fundamental, functional formula, a motif that is repeated across different areas of someone's life. It might condition or determine someone's life choices, direction, modus operandi, or what Lacanians would call their fundamental fantasy. The dream, in common with other formations of the unconscious, presents variants, functional variants to this formula. It's a construction, but it's constructed from signifying material, and as a construction it is transformational, in the sense that, through its successive articulations in the products of the unconscious, it reconfigures the terms of the enigmatic questions or forms of impossibility that the subject is confronted with in its early years. There is no hidden truth of unconscious desire beyond the dream or concealed beneath the dream or behind the dream. As Leclerc says, there is no truth either before or beyond unconscious desire. The formula that constitutes it at the same time represents it and betrays it. If psychoanalyzing a dream or a dreamer doesn't yield a meaning, then a formula, a formal construction like to reveal a secret in Freud's case, is really a better way to describe what's going on. So, a psychoanalysis itself proceeds in a way that mirrors the mechanisms of the unconscious. After all, the idea of a formula isn't so far away from the way Freud presents the dream as like a rebus. Both are super efficient encapsulations of the latent thoughts and manifest content. So, for Leclerc, there could be no better illustration of the fact, crucial for analysis, that there is nothing beyond the text, or better yet, the letter. On this approach, the psychoanalysis of a dream comes full circle, beginning and ending with the encapsulation of unconscious desire in the image of the dream reduced to a single switch word or crossroad word. But there is still one last question, and it's a big one. Freud's life, like each of our lives, was marked by certain accidental, incidental contingencies, small acts of chance that all contributed to make him the man he was to become. The same is true for all of us. If we go along with Leclerc's analysis, Freud's passion for books, destroying them, reading them, devouring them, and later writing them, the ambition to make great discoveries which would reveal the secret of dreams and the unconscious, stem from the two screen memories of childhood. But these are not really explanations in themselves. What was so important about these memories, whether as scenes or screens, that imbued Freud with such a passion that it motivated him to become the famous revealer of secrets of the unconscious. After all, there must be a reason why Freud became the inventor of psychoanalysis and not, say, an itinerant wool merchant like his father. In other words, what made Freud Freud and not a Freud? To answer this, we're going to have to go one step further out, beyond Freud's life to the Freud family history, to events before Freud's birth and what enigmatic questions such events may have engendered in the young Freud. That is, from the biographical level to the transgenerational level. Freud's family tree was convoluted, to say the least. Freud's mother was 21 years the junior of his father, and Jakob Freud had married 3 times already, which meant Sigmund was born an uncle. So it's perhaps no surprise that the major concerns of Freud's later work were to be the same evoked by the circumstances of his upbringing. What are the dynamics of a family? What is the role of the father, of the son to the father, and especially of the father to a woman, or many women? Perhaps, too, we can see the dream of the botanical monograph and the 2 screen memories Freud remembers from his childhood as responses to the questions these enigmas generated. They respond to the irresolvable existential problems of sex and death, common to all human subjects, and offer Freud, in particular, a way to establish his complicated family line. When he is 5, Freud's father gives him and his sister the book on adventures in Persia to destroy. 30 years later, this motif is repeated. The father gives the son another book, this time the Philipson Bible for Freud's 35th birthday, with that portentous inscription about revealing a secret, and the sequence is reanimated. In tracing the connection between the elements of the botanical monograph dream and the circumstances of the family history, we therefore have an example of why we remember certain things rather than others, in spite of their seeming lack of importance. If we look for their significance purely within our own life, they will appear unimportant. It's only when we connect them to the resonances of our family history and what helps us establish that family history that the logic of these elective affinities, the grounds for their transmission, will become apparent. Many years passed since Leclerc's paper, and though his work became somewhat overshadowed by his former teacher Jacques Lacan, historians and biographers were still interested in the dream of the botanical monograph for what it could tell us about Freud and the origins of psychoanalysis. Then, in 2005, in a well-researched and award-winning paper, cultural historian Diane ODonnellue offered a new analysis of the dream. Like Leclerc, O'Donoghue was interested in tracing the link between the manifest content of the dream, Freud's biography, and the Freud family history. But she arrived at a different conclusion. Her focus is on the original book that Freud and his sister were given by their father to destroy when Freud was 5. What was so significant about it, she wonders? Rather than seeing the memory of tearing it apart leaf by leaf as suggestive of anything sexual, she thinks its significance is revealed if we listen closely to what Freud said he remembered about that book, that it was something to do with Reise in Persien, travels, journeys, or voyages in Persia. What other travels, journeys, or voyages were happening in the Freud family at the time? Thanks to Jakob Freud's somewhat precarious profession as a wool merchant, by the age of 10 Freud had lived at 9 different addresses in 3 Central European locations. The family had moved from the rural Freiburg, the setting of the screen memory of The Girl with the Flowers, and for which Freud always mourned his sudden dislocation from a simpler, bucolic existence, to Leipzig, and then on to Vienna, the seething, anti-Semitic capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If Freud had torn up this book at the age of 5, it would have been one of his earliest memories of living in Vienna. And so, we have an initial biographical significance connected with the father's profession. O'Donoghue thinks she has found the book in question, and this is it. Written by one Friedrich Alexander Buser and published when Freud was 5. She suggests that what interested Jakob Freud in the book was the possible use of the plant materials it discussed in the dyeing of wool. Jakob Freud came to Vienna as a wool merchant, a fact that's confirmed by his residency application, and again it's perhaps no accident that his son would himself go on to discover the unconventional use of another plant, cocaine, as an anaesthetic. In Jakob's case, however, this possibility ended in failure, and perhaps this is why he didn't mind giving such an expensive book with its coloured illustrations to his 2 small children to destroy. Yet, O'Donoghue suggests that there may have been a darker side to the circumstances surrounding the book's destruction. Jakob's brother, Joseph, had arrived in Vienna in 1861, when Freud was 5. Records show that in 1865, Joseph was arrested and the following year sentenced to 10 years in prison, along with an accomplice, for the crime of circulating counterfeit currency. Papers from the time also implicated Freud's half-brothers, Emmanuel and Philip, Jakob's sons from his first marriage. Could it be, O'Donoghue wonders, that Jakob was interested in the dye that could be sourced from the plants mentioned in the book because Jakob himself was using them to help his brother counterfeit banknotes? The gift of the book to his children for them to destroy could then be seen in another light. Was Jakob Freud seeking to destroy evidence that would implicate him and his family in criminal activity? Maybe this is all a bit too speculative and circumstantial, but Freud himself acknowledges his uncle Joseph's trouble with the law and the bad impression it left on the family. O'Donoghue thinks that in the dream of the Botanical monograph we see Freud's anxiety that some aspect of this familial taint threatened to come back to haunt him, possibly blocking his career and thwarting his grand ambitions. Perhaps this is the reason for his caginess when hesitating to tell us what he thought the real key to the dream was. Interestingly enough, in support of her case, O'Donoghue looks at the same German dictionary that Freud had used when he was writing about the different connotations of the term unheimlich, uncanny, for his 1919 article. There, under the term Bluten, she notices that it was also used at the time to describe the counterfeiting of money. If O'Donoghue is right, the Botanical monograph dream would evoke for Freud a particular family significance to plants that went beyond cocaine, the screen memory of flowers, or all the other associations to botanical that came out of the dream. Perhaps this is why Freud cut his analysis so short. Whatever we think of her argument, O'Donoghue ends her paper with a powerful appeal for exactly the kind of broadened biographical approach we should endeavour to undertake in psychoanalysis. One which goes beyond an individual sexualised meaning and considers the transgenerational forces at play. Hit subscribe for more videos like this on other topics and click the bell icon to get notified as they're released. For much more exploring psychoanalysis and the work of Jacques Lacan, visit lacanonline.com.